read. I'm on my last chapter. This book's been pretty interesting so far. Last chapter I read was Marcel got sentenced to decapitation in the town square for shooting an Arab on a beach. So that's where we left off on the last chapter. I'm not gonna read acknowledgments. Yeah, no, I'm not gonna read any of that. So it's about 109 to we're about 20 pages. It's 11:20. I'm just gonna stay up, I guess. Fuck my sleep schedule. I just want to get this book over with because I like it. I'm dying to read it. I only want to read it on here. Holds me more accountable. And that's all this is. So, with that, let's do it. Chapter 5, final. For the third time, I've refused to see the chaplain. I don't have anything to say to him. I don't feel like talking, and I'll be seeing him soon enough as it is. All I care about right now is escaping the machinery of justice, seeing if there's any way out of the inevitable. They've put me in a different cell. From this one, when I'm stretched out on my bunk, I see the sky and that's all I see. I spend my days watching how the dwindling of colors turns day into night. Lying here, I put my hands behind my head and wait. I can't count the times I've wondered if there have ever been any instances of condemned men escaping the relentless machinery, disappearing before the executions, or breaking through the cordon of police. Then I blame myself for every time not paying enough attention to accounts of executions. A man should always take an interest in those things. You never know what might happen. I'd read stories in the papers like everybody else, but there must have been books devoted to the subject that I'd never been curious enough to look into. Maybe I would have found some accounts of escapes in them. I might have discovered that if at least one instance the wheel had stopped, that in spite of all the unrelenting calculation, chance and luck had, at least once, changed something. Just once, in a way, I think that would have been enough. My heart would have been taken over from there. The papers were always talking about the debt owed to society. According to them, it had to be paid. But that doesn't speak to the imagination. What really counted was the possibility of escape, a leap to freedom, out of the implacable ritual. A wild run for it would give whatever chance for hope there was. Of course, hope meant being cut down on some street corner, as you ran like mad by a random bullet. But when I really thought it through, nothing was going to allow me such a luxury. Everything was against him. I would just be caught up in the machinery again. This is like the most reflection I've ever seen from this man. Been a stone cold stoic this entire time. Stoic, but more like toxic stoic. Despite my willingness to understand, I just couldn't accept such arrogant certainty. Because, after all, there really was something ridiculously out of proportion between the verdict and such certainty was based on and the oh my god, what is that word? And the imperturbable. That's a Google. That's getting Googled. Ain't no fucking way.
Imperturbable. Imperturbable.
Imperturbable? What are you saying, these words? You could just say composed or collected. Unable to upset or excited. Calm. Something ridiculously out of proportion between the verdict and such certainty was based on, and the imperturbable march of events from the moment the verdict was announced. The fact that the sentence had been read at 8 o'clock at night and not at 5 o'clock, the fact that it could have been an entirely different one, the fact that it had been decided by men who changed their underwear, the fact that it had been handed down in the name of some vague notion called the French, or German, or Chinese people, all of it seemed to detract from the seriousness of the decision. I was forced to admit, however, that from the moment it had been passed, its consequences became as real and as serious as the wall which I pressed the length of my body. At times like this, I remembered a story Mammon used to tell me about my father. I never knew him. Maybe the only thing I did know about the man was the story Mammon would tell me back then. He'd gone to watch a murderer be executed. Just the thought of going had made him sick to his stomach, but he went anyway. And when he came back, he spent half the morning throwing up. I remember feeling a little disgusted by him at the time, but now I understood. It was perfectly normal. How had I not seen that there was nothing more important than an execution, and that when you come right down to it, it was the only thing a man could truly be interested in? If I ever got out of this prison, I would go and watch every execution there was, but I think it was a mistake to even consider the possibility, because at the thought of one fine morning I would find myself a free man standing behind a cordon of police on the outside, as it were, as the thought of being a spectator who comes to watch and then can go throw up afterwards, a wave of poison joy rose in my throat. But I wasn't being reasonable. It was a mistake to let myself get carried away by such imaginings, because the next minute I would get so cold that I would curl up into a ball under my blanket and my teeth would be chattering. I couldn't make them stop. But naturally, you can't always be reasonable. I'm just enjoying this. This is the most I've seen this man, like, besides that exhausting description of how fucking hot it was on the beach before he shot the dude. I like how expressive he's being right now. At other times, for instance, I would make up new laws. I would reform the penal code. I'd realize that the most important thing was to give the condemned man a chance. Even 1 in 1,000 was good enough to set things right. So it seemed to me that you could come up with a mixture of chemicals that, if ingested by the patient, that's the word I'd use, patient, would kill him 9 times out of 10, but he wouldn't know this. That would be the one condition. For by giving it some hard thought, by considering the whole thing calmly, I could see that the trouble with the guillotine was that you had no chance at all. Absolutely none. The fact was that it had been decided once and for all that the patient was to die. It was an open and shut case, a fixed arrangement, a tacit agreement that there was no question of going back on. If by some extraordinary chance the blade failed, they would just start over. So the thing that bothered me most was that the condemned man had to hope the machine would work the first time. And I say that's wrong, and in a way I was right, but in another way I was forced to admit that that was the whole secret of good organization. In other words, the condemned man was forced into a kind of moral collaboration. It was in his interest that everything go off without a hitch. I was also made to see that until that moment I'd mistaken ideas about these things. For a long time I believed, and I don't know why, that to get the guillotine you had to climb stairs onto a scaffold. I think it was because of the French Revolution. I mean, because of everything I'd been taught or shown about it. But one morning I remembered seeing a photograph that appeared in the papers at the time of a much talked about execution. In reality, the machine was set up right on the ground, as simple as you please. It was much narrower than I thought. It was funny, I had never noticed that before. I'd been struck by this picture because the guillotine looked like a precision instrument, perfect and gleaming. You always get exaggerated notions of things you don't know about. I was made to see that contrary to what I thought, everything was very simple. The guillotine is on the same level as the man approaching it. He walks up to it the way you walk up on another person. That bothered me too. Mounting the scaffold, going right up into the sky, was something the imagination could hold on to. Whereas once again the machine destroyed everything. You were killed discreetly, with a little shame, and with great precision. There were 2 other things I was thinking about, the dawn and my appeal. I would reason with myself, though, and try not to think about them anymore. I would stretch out, look at the sky, and force myself to find something interesting about it. It would turn green. That was evening. I would make another effort to divert my thoughts. I would listen to my heartbeat. I couldn't imagine this sound which had been with me for so long could ever stop. I've never really had much of an imagination, but still, I would try to picture the exact moment when the beating of my heart would no longer be going inside my head. But it was no use. The dawn or my appeal would still be there. I would end up telling myself that the most natural, most rational thing was to not hold myself back. They always came at dawn, I knew that, and so I spent my nights waiting for that dawn. I've never liked being surprised. If something is going to happen to me, I want to be there. That's why I ended up sleeping only a little bit during the day, and then, all night long, waited patiently for the first light to show on the pane of sky. The hardest time was the uncertain hour when I knew they usually set to work. After midnight, I would wait and watch. My ears had never heard so many noises or picked up such small sounds. One thing I can say, though, is that in a certain way I was lucky that whole time, since I never heard footsteps. Mammon used to say that you can always find something to be happy about. That you can... In my prison, when the sky turned red and a new day slipped into my cell, I found out that she was right. Because I might just have easily heard footsteps and my heart could have burst. Because I might just as easily have heard footsteps and my heart could have burst. Even though I would rush to the door at the slightest shuffle, even though, with my ear pressed to the wood, I would wait frantically until I heard the sound of my own breathing, terrified to find it so hoarse, like a dog's panting. My heart would not burst after all, and I would have gained another 24 hours. All day long, there was the thought of my appeal. I think I got everything out of it that I could. I would assess my holdings and get the maximum return on my thoughts. I would always begin by assuming the worst. My appeal was denied. Well, so I'm going to die. Sooner than other people will, obviously, but everybody knows life isn't worth living. Deep down, I knew perfectly well that it doesn't matter how much whether you die at 30 or at 70, since in either case, other men and women will naturally go on living, and for thousands of years. In fact, nothing could be clearer. Whether it was now or 20 years from now, I would still be the only one dying. At that point, what would disturb my train of thought was the terrifying leap I would feel my heart take at the idea of having 20 more years of life ahead of me. But I simply had to stifle it by imagining what I'd be thinking in 20 years when it would all come down to the same thing anyways. Since we're all going to die, it's obvious that when and how don't matter. Therefore, and the difficult thing was not to lose sight of all the reasoning that went into this, therefore, I had to accept the rejection of my appeal. So he's like preemptively accepting his rejection to make do and make it easier for him to process this. I'm liking this last chapter. Like this is enjoyable. Then and only then would I have the right, so to speak, would I give myself permission, as it were, to consider the alternative hypothesis. I was pardoned. The trouble was that I would somehow have to cool the hot blood that would suddenly surge through my body and sting my eyes with a delirious joy. It would take all my strength to quiet my heart, to be rational. In order to make my resignation to the first hypothesis more plausible, I had to be level-headed about this one as well. If I succeeded, I gained an hour of calm. That was something anyway. It was at one such moment that I once again refused to see the chaplain. I was lying down and I could tell from the golden glow in the sky that evening was coming on. I had just denied my appeal and I could feel the steady pulse of blood circulating inside me. I didn't need to see the chaplain. For the first time in a long time I thought about Marie. The days had gone long since she'd stopped writing. That evening I thought about it and I told myself maybe she'd gotten tired of being the girlfriend of a condemned man. It also occurred to me that maybe she was sick or dead. These things happen. How was I to know, since apart from our two bodies now separated, there wasn't anything to keep us together or even to remind us of each other? Anyway, after that, remember Marie meant nothing to me. I wasn't interested in her dead. That seemed perfectly normal to me, since I understood very well that people would forget me when I was dead. They wouldn't have anything more to do with me. I wasn't even able to tell myself that it was hard to think those things. It was at that exact moment that the chaplain came in. When I saw him, I felt a little shudder go through me. He noticed it and he told me not to be afraid. I told him that it wasn't his usual time. He replied that it was just a friendly visit and had nothing to do with my appeal, which he knew nothing about. He sat down on my bunk and invited me to sit next to him. I refused. All the same, there was something very gentle about him. He sat there for a few seconds, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at his hands. They were slender and sinewy, and they reminded me of two nimble animals. He slowly rubbed one against the other. Then he sat there, leaning forward like that for so long that I, for an instant, seemed to forget he was there. But suddenly he raised his head and looked straight at me. "Why have you refused to see me?" he asked. I said that I didn't believe in God. He wanted to know if I was sure, and I said that I didn't see any reason to ask myself that question. It seemed unimportant. He then leaned back against the wall, hands flat on his thighs, almost as if it wasn't me he was talking to. He remarked that sometimes we think we're sure when in fact we're not. I didn't say anything. He looked at me and asked, "What do you think?" I said it's possible. In any case, I may not have been sure about what really did interest me, but I was absolutely sure about what didn't. And it just so happened that what he was talking about didn't interest me. He looked away without moving. He looked away and without moving asked me if I wasn't talking that way out of extreme despair. I explained to him that it wasn't desperate. I was just afraid, which was only natural. "Then God can help you," he said. "Every man I have known in your position has turned to him." I acknowledged that was their right. It also meant that they must have had time for it. As for me, I didn't want anybody's help, and I just didn't have the time to interest myself in what didn't interest me. At that point, he threw up his hands in annoyance, but sat forward and smoothed out the folds of his cassock. When he finished, he started in again, addressing me as my friend. If he was talking to me this way, it wasn't because I was condemned to die. The way he saw it, we were all condemned to die. But I interrupted him by saying that it wasn't the same thing and that besides, it wouldn't be a consolation anyway. "Certainly," he agreed. "But if you don't die today, you'll die tomorrow or the next day, and the same question will arise. How will you face that terrifying ordeal?" I said I would face it exactly as I was facing it now. At that, he stood up and looked me straight in the eye. It was a game I knew well. I played it a lot with Emmanuel and Celeste, and usually they were the ones who looked away. The chaplain knew the game well, too. I could tell right away. His gaze never faltered, and his voice didn't falter either, when he said, "Have you no hope at all, and do you really live with the thought that when you die and nothing remains?" "Yes," I said. Then he lowered his head and sat back down. He told me that he pitied me. He thought it was more than a man could bear. I didn't feel anything except that he was beginning to annoy me. Then I turned away and went to stood under the skylight. I leaned my shoulder against the wall without really following what he was saying. I heard him start asking me questions again. He was talking in an agitated, urgent voice. I could see that he was genuinely upset, so I listened more closely. He was expressing his certainty that my appeal would be granted, but I was carrying the burden of a sin which I had to free myself. According to him, human justice was nothing and divine justice was everything. I pointed out that it was the former that had condemned me. His response that it hadn't washed away my sin for all that. I told him I didn't know what a sin was. All they had told me was that I was guilty. I was guilty, I was paying for it, and nothing more could be asked of me. At that point he stood up again. And the thought occurred to me that in such a narrow cell, if he wanted to move around, he didn't have many options. He could either sit down or stand up. I was staring at the ground. He took a step toward me and stopped, as if he didn't dare come any closer. He looked at the sky through the bars. "You're wrong, my son," he said. "More could be asked of you, and it may be asked." "And what's that?" Wait, is he talking to himself? "You're wrong, my son," he said. "More could be asked of you, and it may be asked." "And what's that?" "You could be asked to see." "See what?" The priest gazed around my cell and answered in a voice that sounded very weary to me. "Every stone here sweats with suffering. I know that. I have never looked at them without a feeling of anguish. But deep in my heart I know that the most wretched among you have seen a divine face emerge from their darkness. That is the face you are asked to see." This perked me up a little. I said I had been looking at the stones in these walls for months. There wasn't anything or anyone in the world I knew better. Maybe at one time, way back, I had searched for a face in them, but the face I was looking for was as bright as the sun and the flame of desire. It belonged to Marie. I had searched for it in vain. Now it was all over, and in any case, I'd never seen anything emerge from anything in stones. Anything emerge from any sweating stones. The chaplain looked at me with a kind of sadness. I now had my back flat against the wall, and the light was streaming over my forehead. He muttered a few words I didn't catch and abruptly asked if he could embrace me. "No," I said. He turned and walked over to the wall and slowly ran his hand over it. "Do you really love this earth as much as all that?" he murmured. I didn't answer. He stood there with his back to me for quite a long time. His presence was grating and oppressive. I was just about to tell him to go, to leave me alone, when all of a sudden, turning toward me, he burst out, "No, I refuse to believe you. I know that one time or another you've wished for another life." I said, "Of course I have." But it didn't mean anything more than wishing to be rich, to be able to swim faster, or to have a more nicely shaped mouth. It was all the same, but he stopped me and wanted to know how I pictured this other life. Then I shouted at him, "One where I could remember this life," and that's when I told him I'd had enough. He wanted to talk to me about God again, but I went up to him and made one last attempt to explain to him that I only had a little time left and I didn't want to waste it on God. He tried to change the subject by asking me why I was calling him Monsieur, and not Father. That got me mad. I told him he wasn't my father, and he wasn't even on my side. "Yes, my son," he said, putting his hand on my shoulder. "I am on your side, but you have no way of knowing it because your heart is blind. I shall pray for you." Then, I don't know why, but something inside me snapped. I started yelling at the top of my lungs, and I insulted him and told him not to waste his prayers on me. I grabbed him by the collar of his cassock. I was pouring out on him everything that was in my heart. Cries of anger and cries of joy. He seemed so certain about everything, didn't he? And yet none of his certainties was worth one hair of a woman's head. He wasn't even sure he was alive, because he was living like a dead man. Whereas it looked as if I was the one who'd come up empty-handed. But I was sure about me, about everything, surer than he could ever be, sure of my life and sure of death I had waiting for me. Yes, that was all I had, but at least I had as much of a hold on it as it had on me. I had been right. I was still right. I was always right. I had lived my life one way, and I could just tell the way I lived in another. I could just as well lived in another. I had done this, and I hadn't done that. I hadn't done this thing, but I had done another. And so, it was as if I had waited all this time for this moment and for the first light of dawn to be vindicated. Nothing mattered, and I knew why. So did he. Throughout the whole absurd life I'd lived, a dark wind had been rising toward me from somewhere deep in my future, across the years that were still to come, and as it passed, this wind leveled whatever was offered to me at the time, in years no more real than the ones I was living. What did other people's deaths or a mother's love to me matter to me? Whoa. What did other people's deaths or a mother's love matter to me? What did his God, or the people, or the lives people chose, or the fate they think they elect matter to me when they're all elected by the same fate? Me and billions of privileged people like him who also called themselves my brothers? Couldn't he see that? Everybody was privileged. There were only privileged people. The others would all be condemned one day. And he wouldn't be condemned too. And he would be condemned too. What would it matter if he were accused of murder and then executed because he didn't cry at his mother's funeral? Salamano's dog was worth just as much as his wife. The little robot woman was just as guilty as the Parisian woman Mason married, or as Marie, who had wanted me to marry her. What did it matter that Ramon was as much of my friend as Celeste, who was worth a lot more than him? What did it matter that Marie now offered her lips to a new Marceau? Couldn't this condemned man see that from somewhere deep in my future all the shouting had me gasping for air? But they were already tearing the chaplain from my grip and the guards were threatening me. He calmed them, though, and looked at me for a moment without saying anything. His eyes were full of tears. Then he turned and disappeared. With him gone, I was able to calm down again. I was exhausted and threw myself on my bunk. I must have fallen asleep because I woke up with the stars in my face. Sounds of the countryside were drifting in. Smells of night, earth, and salt air were cooling my temples. The wondrous peace of that sleeping summer flowed through me like a tide. Then in the dark hour before dawn, sirens blasted. They were announcing departures for a world that now and forever meant nothing to me. For the first time in a long time I thought about Mammon. I felt as if I understood why at the end of her life she had taken a fiancé. Why she had played at beginning again. Even there, in that home where lives were fading out, evening was a kind of wistful respite. So close to death, Mammon must have felt free then and ready to live it again, all again. I'm like, this is terrible for me. For the first time in a long time, I thought about Mammon. I felt as if I understood why at the end of her life she had taken a fiancé. Why she had played at beginning again. Even there, in that home where lives were fading out, evening was a kind of wistful respite. So close to death, Mammon must have felt free then and ready to live it all again. Nobody had the right to cry over her, and I felt ready to live it all again too. As if that blind rage had washed me clean, rid me of hope. For the first time, in that night alive with the signs and stars, I opened myself to the gentle indifference of the world, finding it so much like myself. So like a brother, really. I felt that I had been happy and that I was happy again. For everything to be consummated, for me to feel less alone. I had only one wish, that there would be a large crowd of spectators the day of my execution, and that they greet me with cries of hate. And that's it. That was really good. You know, as short of a book as this was, it was a very good story. And this is from someone who doesn't read a lot of fiction. I don't read a lot of fiction at all. Actually, I don't have a single fiction book up there. I mean, I have read the Gospel of John, so I don't know if you'd go that far, but for a first full read through a fiction book, this was really good. I like this. I will be excited to pick up The Myth of Sisyphus, The Rebel. There's a couple others. We had like a whole collection of these, and they're like a lot of them are like this thin. It's a good story. Marceau, I mean, looks like he finally opened himself up. He's one of those people that, like, at the moment of death, came to realize, hey, man, life's a whole lot different from what I thought it was, and I took a lot of shit for granted. I mean, I would honestly give it a 4 out of 5 off rip. I enjoyed this a lot. I mean, certain parts were kind of annoying, but that's just because I'm not used to fiction books and the way that they write. So I'm not used to the overwhelming amount of imagery that comes with it. So with that, I'm gonna pull up the review. Alright, let's hear it. I want to hear that review of it, the summary.
In part 2, chapter 5 of The Stranger in his prison cell.
Oh shit, what happened? Oh.
In part 2, chapter 5 of The Stranger in his prison cell, Merceau fantasizes about somehow disappearing or breaking through the police guards to escape. Merceau thinks he would reform penal codes in a way that would give a condemned man a remote chance of escape. Being executed by the guillotine gives him no chance. Merceau knows that on the day of his execution, people will come to take him away at dawn. Merceau focuses on his appeal being denied and resigns himself to the thought that everyone dies at some point. Then he gives himself permission to consider that his appeal has been granted, a thought which causes unspeakable joy to surge through him. But then he reminds himself to quiet his heart, to be rational. The chaplain visits Merceau and asks Merceau whether he believes in God. Merceau says no. The chaplain asks Merceau whether he can live with the belief that when he dies, nothing remains. Merceau replies that he can and begins to get annoyed by the chaplain. The chaplain claims Merceau should be concerned with divine justice and washing away his sins. Merceau doesn't know what sin is. The chaplain asserts that even the most wretched people see a divine face in the darkness. Merceau agrees. He saw a face as bright as the sun, Marie's face. But now, that's all over. Angry at the chaplain's questions, Merceau shouts that he only wishes for another life where I could remember this life. When the chaplain says that he will pray for Merceau, Merceau becomes infuriated. He yells at the chaplain, insulting him and grabbing his collar, claiming he is more real than the chaplain because at least he is sure of his life and sure of death. Merceau exclaims that he has always been right and that every person considers himself privileged. But in reality, everyone is condemned to death. No life has meaning more than any other. The guards appear and yank Merceau away from the chaplain. Alone in his cell, Merceau calms down. At dawn, he hears a siren blast announcing departures for a world that now and forever meant nothing to him. Merceau's rage at the chaplain rids him of hope, giving him the strange freedom to live life over again. Merceau opens himself to the benign indifference of the universe. To feel less alone, Merceau wishes that a crowd of spectators at his execution will greet him with cries of hate. Merceau accepts the finality of death as he faces his impending execution. He must either reject his view of life as meaningless and accept hope, or reaffirm his view of the meaningless finality of death. The chaplain's visit is one last attempt by the Christian establishment to force Merceau to accept its ideas of morality. In the end, Merceau hopes that the spectators at his execution will greet him with cries of hate. As the object of this hatred, Merceau will have achieved a personal meaning, thereby transcending existential nihilism.
Existential nihilism. That's a good way to describe the last chapter of this book. It's effectively what happened, right? I think, for it being one of my first fiction books, like, what do some people say? Is there anybody... I mean, this got him the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957. That's what it says in here, right? Yeah. So, this is a really... I enjoyed this. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I hope that I enjoy the other ones. Fiction... What are some other fiction books I have? See. I know I have Brother. I plan to read that. I started it and I got to like chapter 3, but it's been like over a year, so I have no memory of what happened I know like bits and pieces, so I'm just gonna start that over. It's a horror book. Here, let me just grab them. Put this bad boy in the red shelf. Okay, so just going off of what the genres themselves say, the only fiction books I only have 3. Okay, so Brother is one I plan on getting to. I don't remember what chapter I got to, but in the 2 or 3 chapters I did read from this, I enjoyed it. So I will be picking this back up. I'm excited about this one, No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. I picked this one up because it was recommended to me alongside of The Stranger, so I do look forward to picking this up. I may read this next. I might try to because it's like the print of it's weird. Like it's like small text crunched under the page, so there's like large margins on the top and bottom, so it might be a quick read. I don't know how many pages is it. Not even 200. Yeah, like 170. And then I don't know if this is accurate, but Notes by Dostoevsky, Notes from the Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. So I plan on reading these. These are the 3 fiction books I have. I don't have any other storybooks. Everything else I have is like either a history book, a nonfiction, like political or history, or philosophy or psychology. So I'll try to crank out some of those. My goal this year is 10 books. Out to the Kamala Harris one, I'm not counting that one, right? 10 books I started this year so far. I believe The Stranger is my first actual book. I went cover to cover. I don't know what my next one will be, because this one right here, I mean this one, like it's a little bit longer. It's a little bit longer than The Stranger. 132 pages, so about 9 pages longer. But like they cram each page. Like they fill it to the brink. So it might take a little longer. But I'm excited. I'm excited for all 3 of these. Mostly for No Longer Human. I heard that one's really brutal than this one, and I have really no expectation for this. I just wanted to pick up a Dostoevsky book, and this was just the shortest one, right? Because I don't want to pick up one like Crime or Punishment or the Brothers of Karamazov or whatever, and like those are like 300, 400, 500 page books. I don't want to not like them and just have them sit on my shelf, right? I want to get a taste of it. I was told this was a good introduction and whatnot, so I don't know what the next book will be though. Not sure. I'm gonna try it. So I'm like between 2 or 3, so you'll probably know in 2 days, 3 days. But thank you for riding with me on this one. I'll be back. Kisses. Oh.